So, as I discussed earlier, the Cold War begins in 1945, where you have the first couple of conferences after World War II, dividing up the dividing up Europe into the different portions that would be controlled in the years to come by both the Soviet Union and the British, the French, and the Americans, particularly when we look at Germany. You also have another major problem that emerges, right? And that is that the Soviet Union not only decides that it's going to take over portions of Eastern Germany and create, so Eastern Germany becomes known as the German Democratic Republic, but you also have the Soviet Union moving into other parts of Eastern Europe to get its own foothold there. So you have it moving into Poland in the year in 1947, and you have Czechoslovakia, Romania, and other places that come under Soviet control. And as that begins to emerge, we start to call these things buffer states or satellite states. Buffer states is probably the best way to think of it. And what we talk about when we talk about something called buffer states, we think of this as if somebody was trying to invade from the West, Western Germany or Italy or wherever, they would have to invade through these areas. They work as a buffer or an area to sort of slow the advance into the Soviet Union. This is really begins to show the hostility that the West really feared, right? So when we talk about the West again, we're talking about places like Western Europe, the United States, Japan is involved here, and then the East, we typically are referring to Eastern Europe, basically any part of the Soviet world. We sometimes call this, or they call it, sometimes refer to this as a divided line called the Iron Curtain. Now, the Iron Curtain, most famously, comes from a speech given by Winston Churchill in 1946, right, where he discusses that a Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, and behind it is all the capitals of Central Europe and Eastern Europe. It's given at a commencement address, which might be a strange place for you to think about having a sort of Cold War message. But the first portion of the speech, and this is only an excerpt of it, the speech is actually one that is referring to sort of, this is your time, America. This is time, your young people. You cannot let this go. You cannot fail at this because there's so much at risk. So this Iron Curtain is something that divides the Western countries, the democratic countries, from the Eastern communist countries. And it's a interesting way to think about it, right? Iron is impenetrable. It's a solid boundary, and it very much describes that, right? And if you notice here, there's a little dot within Germany, Eastern Germany, that is blocked out. That's Berlin. Berlin is within Eastern Europe, within Eastern Germany, but it's also obviously the German capital. So then, if it's the German capital and it's in Eastern Europe, what has to be done there? It is ultimately divided as well. When Berlin is divided, this begins hostilities because the Eastern country, German Democratic Republic, doesn't like the fact that you have Western countries, Western people within Berlin, right? So Berlin is divided, and portion of West Berlin, portion of Berlin, West Berlin, is a democratic country supported by British, French, and Americans. They are getting consumer goods from the British, French, and the Americans. And that obviously doesn't look good for the Eastern Europeans, and particularly because between 1945 and the 1960s, you could go from East Germany into West Berlin and then fly anywhere in the world. So between 1948 and 1960, there's thousands of East Germans who are fleeing communism through West Berlin. Obviously, that leads to the creation of the Berlin Wall. So you have these massive hostilities and these sort of uncertainties that are arising throughout this period. You also obviously have increased tensions between the West and the Soviet Union. So when Churchill issues his Iron Curtain speech, Stalin responds to that speech a little bit later. And in that speech, he talks about how the British are basically no better than the Nazis. They want only people to speak English. Um, they are conquering all these places. They believe in racial supremacy, and then he sort of ends with, if if you tally all this up, the Soviet Union has lost more of its people to the Second World War than the British have. We've sacrificed greater amounts, so we should be allowed to have these territories. So it's a lot of discussion here about this sort of um, fear of each other, fear of being conquered, uncertainty towards each other, and all of that leads to some major philosophical underpinnings within the Cold War. So within the Cold War, there are sort of three guiding philosophies, and that's what I'm trying to show you here. The first is that there's this fear of the domino theory. If you've ever, as a kid, lined up dominoes and you've hit one and then the others fall, that is what many people believed would happen with communism. If one country fell to communism, then the others or surrounding it would fall too. So if you had the Soviet Union, for say, going into communism in 1919, then you have other countries falling in that too, right? So then ultimately Poland and East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and others. This really becomes even more pronounced when you have China become communist in 1949. That's really when the fears begin, because then you could see Korea become it, and then you begin the Korean War in 1950, Vietnam and those engagements in the 1950s and 60s, Laos, Cambodia, pretty much the rest of South Asia. So the domino theory here is a guiding principle that if one country falls to communism, the others around it will fall too. So if you are afraid of it falling, you must contain communism. Basically, fight communism wherever it goes. Stop it and make sure it doesn't continue. So that means that's why you get into the Korean War, you get into the Vietnam War, and other engagements like that. What we call proxy wars, right? The idea that you are not fighting directly with each other, but you are fighting through surrogates, right? So the United States is supporting South Korea, while communists, China and the Soviet Union are supporting North Korea. The same would be true in Vietnam. But so the U.S. and the Soviet Union and China are not fighting each other directly, but they're fighting each other through the other. Finally, if that is those are your two major opinions, then what you need to do is support democracies, and that's where the Truman Doctrine comes in. So the Truman Doctrine, issued by Harry Truman in 1947, is an idea of how do we support those friendly democracies around the globe. So the Truman Doctrine is about this idea about supporting democracy. What we happen as a result then is billions of dollars are then issued by the United States government to our allies, both in Europe and in Asia. So in Europe, huge sums of money are shipped into places like Britain, France, and Italy, our very close allies. But you also have money going into Spain and Portugal, Greece, Turkey. You have huge sums of money going to Europe. And again, it's the idea that we want to make sure that they economically recover, that they are able to sustain themselves and sustain democracy. This is particularly true with a place like West Germany, that you have huge numbers of dollars going into West Germany, again, to support business. The other part of this is that you want to make sure that the Soviet Union can't come in and sort of coerce them into socialism. The idea here is if we support their industry and support their business, they will not want to become communist. It comes with the tagline, nothing stops a communist like a full stomach. So the Marshall Plan is what this money gets distributed through. So the official name of it is the European Recovery Plan, but it is sort of more unofficially known as the Marshall Plan, named after George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State. So something to the tune of about $13 billion goes throughout Europe. And you'll see here that where it goes, right? Britain, France, a little bit to Spain, a little bit to Portugal, Greece, Turkey, Italy gets quite a bit, West Germany gets quite a bit, the Netherlands, and Holland get some, to get all these different countries getting some. Again, the point of this is to support industry throughout Europe. So, in order to defend each side during the Cold War, there is the development of alliances. Again, the world at this point is just sort of pairing off into different types of alliances. So, within the United States, or at least the West, what you have is the support of something called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, something that is becoming NATO, something that is becoming very popular to discuss in the more recent years. At the beginning, you have 12 nations sign up. You could probably ones you could figure, right? The United States, Canada, Mexico, Britain, France, Italy, Portugal, Spain, West Germany, the Dutch, the Netherlands, Belgium, and others, right? Now, the point here is this is a strategic alliance so that if the Soviet Union attacks any of them, then the others will have their back. A few years later, to counter this, you have the beginning of the Warsaw Pact, which is basically the communist equivalent. But there are more communist nations, so their forces become larger. These begin the sort of hot engagements of the Cold War. You have the Vietnam conflict and the Korea conflict. But when we look at places like the ones that sort of most affect the United States, which is what I would like to sort of talk about now, you have things like the Bay of Pigs incident, right? Where in 1959, Cuba becomes communist under Fidel Castro. And then 2 years later, the young new President Kennedy tries to overthrow the Cuban revolutionaries. So he, through the help of Latin American militias that the United States helped pay for, the CIA had helped pay for, they begin to invade the Bay of Pigs. The only problem was Kennedy sort of resisted. Air support stopped coming, and these Latin American fighters wound up getting arrested, and many of them brutally killed on the beaches of Cuba, of the Bay of Pigs. So it's a bad incident for Kennedy. It really hurts his reputation, and as a result, you have obviously huge incidences, which sort of, the next thing is the Cuban Missile Crisis that happens in 1962. Vietnam, which starts in the late 1950s and goes until the 1970s, is really the first of America's endless wars. It is a war that Congress never declares. It's a policing action. It's an idea of containment. In 1968, you have the North Vietnamese, the communist portion of Vietnam, winding up having huge attacks in something called the Tet Offensive, where there's a all-out invasion of the South. It winds up really dividing and killing a lot of people. Ultimately, in the 1970s, the United States and the Allies need to pull out of Vietnam because it is not a tenable situation anymore. The early Cold War, or the Cold War in general, up until the 1970s, is one where there is a lot of uncertainty. This is the age of the space race. Sputnik goes up in the 1950s. John F. Kennedy pledges he will go to the moon. He will send people to the moon. It is all about the defense of the United States. It's the defense of democracy. But it's a lot of sort of backstabbing, and it's a lot of fear. It's a period of massive trouble and concern. The last thing here is the arms race, right? Previously, I had discussed how the atomic bombs are assembled by the United States to try and show the Soviet Union not to mess with us. Well, what you have happening is the United States develops the nuclear weapons first. 1945 and onward, the United States is really ahead of everybody else. The Soviet Union doesn't have much. The Soviet Union finally gets the bomb in 1949, and they catch up very quickly. Within 10, 15 years, they had as many as the United States had ever had, the most numbers. And then they peak, with 45,000 atomic bombs, which is a huge number. Again, period of mass uncertainty, people hiding under desks, fear of when we will be annihilated.